All right, it's 3 o'clock. I'd like to welcome you to Houston Climate Week. There's a very exciting lineup this week of lots of discussions and talks amongst a lot of city leaders and professional leaders about how we can positively impact the climate action plan and how we can get that moving in a way that benefits many communities in our region and our city, both from a health standpoint, economic standpoint, and resiliency standpoint. We are very excited to be the offering this afternoon as we talk about growing climate solutions, where our focus is going to be on how nature itself, um, as we endure the challenges that nature brings, how nature itself can also be a solution to these issues and help to create a community that's more equitable, green, and healthy. So we're going to lean in here this afternoon with three really dynamic folks who are helping to lead the charge in transforming our city, our region, and our communities in terms of using nature-based solutions. And in a moment, we're going to have an opportunity to get to know these folks a little bit. They're going to introduce themselves. Um, they're going to let you know a little bit about their perspective, where they're coming from, and what their work involves. We will then head into a session where we ask folks questions about how we get to a different scale of actionable change using nature in the city and the region, how the climate action plan figures into that equation. And then we're going to go ahead and open up for some questions. I'll invite the panelists to ask questions of themselves and for the participants to ask questions as well. So I have made Kelly Ondrasik from the City of Houston's Parks and Recs Department, Marianne Piacentini, and Katie Coyne, our co-hosts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by kind of setting the table for what I think is going to be a very good meal here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on, just big picture scale, before we get into the more of the hows and the whats of what needs to occur. What I will ask our co-hosts to do is, as I do this presentation, just go ahead and take a look at the chat function there, which is live and active, and just make sure that we're all minding our P's and Q's about that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just start a very simple introduction here. But it goes without saying that many of you have seen the Climate Action Plan. If you have not seen the Houston Climate Action Plan, it dropped earlier this year during the COVID pandemic, the city felt that it was definitely important enough to go ahead and launch this. They'd put a lot of work in working with many different sectors to get this done. So we're very excited to have this plan to reflect back on and to work off of. And so as you look at this plan, you will look at the fact that, and anybody who's lived here for 2 seconds knows that we have many different challenges that affect the greater Houston area. And as you look at the kind of mitigation and adaptation solutions on the right, this graphic is from the plan itself. There are many, many natural solutions and nature-based solutions that we can deploy across the city and across the region, some of which are already building, some of which will be fairly new in terms of scale. But I just wanted to point out that nature has a really large role in what this region looks like and how we conceive of climate action. If you picked up the business section this morning, you will have seen this very important article on what was just released yesterday. This just dropped fresh off the press, the climate impact assessment for the city of Houston. These partners are listed here. This was the work of multiple hands, including the Office of Resilience and Sustainability, but also Dr. Catherine Hayhoe and her excellent team at Texas Tech University has put together a really comprehensive dive into the already existing conditions that climate change is presenting us with, and where under different scenarios we might head in terms of the quality of life and how much heat, how much precipitation, how much our habitat, our climate is changing around us, and what impacts that might have. So this is a really important document with lots and lots of potential impacts for our region. Just a real quick overview, recap of some of the things that we've been seeing over the last few years. Houston has already felt these impacts pretty strongly. Since 1970, our nighttime temperatures have gone up by 5.1 degrees. And our daytime temperatures were hitting 100-degree temperatures more often. By mid-century, by 2065, if no climate action is taken, we could see over 70 days per year of feels-like temperatures of 105 degrees or more, which means that, one, we need to obviously take climate action to slow the rate of carbon going into the atmosphere, but we're also going to have to use nature and other policies and technologies to make this a more livable place as the city warms, and that's really the focus of where we're going today. I don't think I need to tell many of you who have been here for a while that we are at the literal epicenter. The terrible fires in California notwithstanding, but in terms of events, in terms of climate disaster events, when you adjust it, we are really in the darkest red between 1980 and 2020 of the number of disasters, total disasters here in Texas. We have felt the impacts, the early wave of climate change very, very strongly, both here in Houston and in our state. This was in the climate assessment as well, and this looks at different scenarios of if we get better control over carbon in the atmosphere or not, and what this could mean for inundation of our coastal communities. As you can see, under the kind of the businesses as usual, much of our coast is just underwater. It is fairly dire for a coastal city like Texas if we don't address these. And one other thing that I think some of our guests are going to mention is right now, in terms of getting to carbon neutrality in 2050, much of the focus is on energy transition, transportation options, building optimization, and things like that. But this offset category, which is how do you offset for carbon you're going to put up in the atmosphere, either mechanically or using nature to sequester carbon, that portfolio of offsets grows larger and larger and larger as we get closer to 2050. So even though much of the energy around the climate plan right now is about energy transition and transportation, because those are two huge factors, we're going to see some opportunities to better utilize nature at scale to help us meet those targets. So specifically within the Climate Action Plan, just to refresh everybody's memory, this is under the energy transition section. And goal number 3, I'll just read it out loud. I don't really like reading things off of PowerPoints, but is to restore, protect, and enhance Houston's natural ability to capture and store carbon. And this is going to be both to increase carbon capture by doing plantings and restorations of indigenous ecosystems, but also I want you to think about how we can work together to safeguard current carbon sinks like the Katy Prairie, the Damon Prairie, the Columbia Bottomlands, and other key ecosystems. So it's planting more to sequester more, but it's restoring and protecting what we have already. And then these other two right here, these are really important: protect, expand, and manage municipal park assets to maximize environmental and recreational benefits. So how can we wring the most functionality out of those landscapes? And I'm so happy to have Kelly Ondrasik with us to talk about that today. And then we'll also discuss where carbon offsets might fit into this whole thing. Okay. And lastly, just as I mentioned, one of the things that's emerging as a real regional solution to multimodal mobility, which takes cars off the road, connects people and communities, provides more ecology that's positive, are the massive work happening with Bayou Greenways, the Beyond the Bayous project, Headwaters to Baywaters, which I'll let Marianne speak about, and other opportunities to better connect our community and put climate-friendly projects on the ground as well. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing here. And with that, I am going to invite our incredibly capable speakers in here one by one to introduce themselves and their work, and a little bit about how they see their work fitting into the Houston Climate Action Plan. And then we'll start to get into these questions. I'll be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And we're just going to start off with Katie Coyne, since she's at the top of my screen. As a co-host, you should be able to share your screen, and I will invite you to take it away, Katie.
I thought I was going to go last because of the order. You caught me off guard.
Sorry.
All right, so I've been told I have 5 minutes to introduce myself, my firm, and what I'm passionate about, which I'm going to do my best. So I work for a company called Asakura Robinson. We were founded in Houston, started as a landscape architecture practice, and now do planning and urban design as well, with offices in New Orleans, Austin, and Minneapolis. Have always kind of had this really community-driven mindset and equity-driven mindset, in addition to a very environmentally focused and sustainability focused mindset. So it's kind of a hallmark of our work and a lot of the work that I lead, especially. This is my visual resume. I'm not going to go through each thing, but I thought it might be helpful to understand a little bit more about my background and why I think the way I do. So, you know, have always really valued connection with nature, outdoor education. My first job was with the Girl Scouts. I actually have an undergrad in ecological science, and did some more traditional ecological research, coastal fisheries research, but then had a stint in health science, was a Peace Corps volunteer. My mother doesn't know I put this on here, but I was a bartender for a while. I would not put that on my normal resume for a job application, but I put that on here because it taught me how to communicate. My tips depended on it. I was a teacher, a high school science teacher for a little while, and what brought me to Texas, which if you had told me I was going to fall in love with Texas, maybe 20 years ago, I would have thought you were a little crazy, but I have. But I've been brought to Texas by grad school, and went to UT Austin for their master's in community and regional planning and sustainable design program, and stuck around. Fell in love with all the different communities and all the different really complicated ways we can do good work in the state. I've been a principal at Asakura Robinson now for a little while, and I lead our urban ecology studio. The goal of that studio is really just to integrate more science and data into what is really an equity-driven practice across the board. A few other things about me and who I am right now. I also serve as vice chair on the Environmental Commission and Joint Sustainability Committee for the City of Austin, as a board member with the Trail Foundation and a board member with Equality Texas, which is the largest LGBTQ advocacy and lobbying organization in the state. And so hopefully what you can see in this very brief highlight of my life is that I really think critically about how we can think about social resilience, social justice in concert with how we integrate science and ecological thinking and sustainability into the work that we do. So I'm going to get through 9 projects in the next 3 minutes. I'm only going to say what my favorite things about them are. So Resilient Houston was a privilege to work on. The 2 things I love about this project are that the entire thing is structured around 5 scales. Everything from individual and family scales all the way up to a regional scale. And so that multi-scalar thinking is really important to the work that I do. The other thing about this resilience plan, and a lot of resilience plans that are coming out lately, are that they're looking much more holistically than what we historically did. So we're not just looking at climate resilience or infrastructure resilience, but we're also looking at social and economic resilience, among other things. Vision Galveston was a great project we did with Hewitt Zollers. This is, again, thinking really holistically across scales for the entire island of Galveston. But what I love most about this project is we were able to engage 15% of the population of the island of Galveston. And it's the only project that we've ever had that we actually had people lining up like they were in line for a Disney ride to do one of the workshop stations in our workshops for this. So we had this amazing engaged community, and now we're working on implementing work that came out of Vision Galveston through a project called Green Galveston. So how can we bake more nature into even the very urban places in Galveston and think holistically about climate resilience, urban heat mitigation, and other multifunctional benefits. I highlight Montrose Livable Centers study as a shameless ploy to get people who live in Montrose or near Montrose or who love Montrose to take this survey. But this is a really great example of a project where we're looking at a neighborhood scale, but with that same kind of systems thinking. How can we improve quality of life for residents in Montrose by thinking about greening up, but also by thinking about increasing mobility options. How can we think about improving health for residents? How can we think about the economic resilience of this neighborhood and also the culture and identity of this place? So this is a virtual tour you can take that has survey questions at each stop. The link is here. But if you live in Montrose or love Montrose, please check this out. Austin Climate Equity Plan is something that we weren't consultants on, but I was able to serve as co-chair of the steering committee. What I love most about this plan is that it is, as far as I can tell, one of the most equity-driven climate plans that's come out. And I think we're a little ahead of the game in terms of Texas climate plans. This is our first update. Our first plan came out in 2015. But one of the things I loved about this is that we actually hired and paid a living wage to community climate ambassadors who were able to connect with their trusted networks who we historically have been really bad at reaching, really bad at connecting with. And that really changed at least part of the narrative around how we embed, lived experiences and stories from community into this process. We do a lot of parks planning work. It's a little bit different though than normal parks planning work. This one is ParkSmart Precinct 1, where we really framed all of our thinking around parks through how they can support resilience. We just wrapped up the Pasadena Healthy Parks Plan, and this is a plan that really looks at how health intersects with environmental vulnerability, with socioeconomic vulnerability and park access. And so the map in the background is a cumulative map that highlights over 60 variables to help us prioritize where to invest in parks to have the most impact in Pasadena. The thing you see on the right is just one item from a toolkit that we created to say, once you know where to invest, how should you invest? And based on the science and based on what we heard from community. So again, balancing that community voice with also science and literature. All right, how am I doing, Jaime? Do I have like 1 more minute?
We'll get you 1 minute.
Okay, thanks. Healthy Places Toolkit, this is a great example of how we're starting to think more about the public health space. And so this is something we did for Episcopal Health Foundation, which is based in Houston. And you can see the contents here that really focus on all the different social determinants of health in the built environment. And this document is meant to make more accessible opportunities for engaging in the built environment to clinics and healthcare workers who want to get more involved in upstream health outcomes. All right, I'll skip a few and leave you with this quote because this is also a key part of the way I think about things. Here's a quote by Pema Chodron. What a predicament. We seem doomed to suffer simply because we have a deep-seated fear of how things really are. Our attempts to find lasting pleasure, lasting security are at odds with the fact that we're part of a dynamic system in which everything and everyone is in process. So I like to think about how we think about systematic change, but also how we help our communities cope with change that is both inevitable, but that we're also trying to adapt for more resilient and more equitable outcomes. All right. Thanks, Jaime.
Okay, we're going to bring in Marianne Piacentini. I should know how to say her name. I worked for her for 12 years. I had the fortune of doing that. She is president and CEO of the Katy Prairie Conservancy, a very dynamic local land trust that's working upstream of Houston to save a historic prairie for many benefits. Marianne, go ahead and take it away.
I've just got just two. Okay. Hi, I'm Marianne Piacentini. I'm the president and CEO of the Katy Prairie Conservancy, which is a nonprofit land trust. Before I tell you about that, Jaime asked you to tell you about ourselves. And I know some of you on the screen, but not all of you. So I'm actually a New Englander, although like Katy, I have fallen in love with Texas and stayed here and produced 2 Texans and have 1 Bostonian. So he's outnumbered, but it's okay. I have an undergraduate degree in political science from the University of New Hampshire, and I actually have a city planning degree. I'm not a biologist or a botanist from Harvard University, And I came to love the land after having worked for a lot of different things, including I worked for Community Development Block Grant Program for the mayor's office, and I got to see firsthand the inequities that the mayor talked about when he had his opening speech to the Climate Action Plan. And I knew that then I wanted to make a difference in terms of trying to provide capital improvements and other programs to vulnerable communities. I didn't stay there though. I stayed there 3 years, and then I went and dealt with the arts and humanities, both here and in Massachusetts. And then I came back and I actually helped develop the master plan with noted consultants for Herman Park before it became a conservancy and really famous. It was Friends of Herman Park, and took over as the director of the Katy Prairie Conservancy in 1999, and love it because I get to practice law without a license. I get to be a land developer of pure land, not buildings, and do all kinds of fun things. And as you can see here, this looks a little bigger than the Katy Prairie's original Harris, Waller, and Fort Bend focus areas. It's because in 2017, we expanded our focus so that we're now in 9 counties in Southeast Texas. We've saved 24,000 acres so far, and by the end of this year, we will have saved 30,000. We've not given up on trying to get 30 to 50,000 acres of land protected on the Katy Prairie, but we recognize that there's a lot of other coastal prairie areas that need to be protected, and we're working in those other counties to do that, and also include wetlands and agricultural lands as well. And some of you may ask, well, who cares? Why do you want to save this land? What's important about it? And I think it has a lot of importance. First of all and foremost, it's important for people. I mean, it improves the quality of life. We all know how important it is to get outside. I think during this pandemic, people have been using parks and open spaces more than they ever did before because they have no place else to go, whether it's in their own neighborhood, it's along a bayou, or it is out in the country, as some of our areas are. And it just calms you down, it makes you feel better, it improves your health. It's also great for just recreational opportunities, whether you want to hike or bike or you just want to walk around. It improves water quality as well. Our wetlands are nature's kidneys. The water that comes out of those wetlands is cleaner than the water that goes into them because of their filtering of pollutants and sediment. We also have agricultural opportunities. A lot of people are worried about food security. And one of the things that we do is that we keep farmers and ranchers on the land. If we buy the land and there is an active farmer or rancher there who wants to continue to provide those services, we make sure that they can stay on that land. And then we also actually provide carbon sequestration benefits, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. But we do, soil is a great sequester of carbon. And we find that disturbing those soils is putting carbon back into the air. So we want to restore them and put that carbon back in. We also provide extraordinary wildlife habitat. We've been named a global important bird area by National Audubon. And we're one of 17 sites in Texas. And it's because of the extraordinary habitat we have for grassland birds. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that since 1970, we've lost 3 billion birds in the United States and Canada. Well, one of the things that our large-scale grasslands do is provide habitat, roosting areas, nesting areas for those upland species. So we want to be able to continue to do that. We also provide opportunities for people to actually do research. And we have Western chicken turtle research that we're doing. We had a person when Jaime was on board who actually looked about reintroducing the sort of iconic species that used to be on the Katy Prairie, which include bison. It includes the Atwater's prairie chickens, Houston toad. And so we're looking at all those kinds of things. We also provide extraordinary pollinator habitat. We probably have more native milkweed on our lands than most other areas around here. And I've really got not a green thumb, but I've actually been able to actually have native, anyway, pollinator habitat in my own backyards. And it's amazing, the butterflies and the hummingbirds and all the things that are coming in. And so, last but not least, a lot of people talk about the Katy Prairie as a sponge and about grasslands as being able to hold water. And while we know we can't eliminate flooding, one of the things that we do is that we store water in our wetlands. We soak water when we infiltrate into our tall roots of our grasses, our tall grasses, and we actually slow down water because of the roughness of the area. There are these little dips, beautiful little and little hills, little Mima mounds, very small, but working well to hold that water in addition to the vegetation, which slows it down, so that whatever we can do to store, soak, or slow down water helps downstream. And so I think that, we have a lot of things that we're doing in terms of protecting land while it's still available, but we're also restoring land. And one of the things that Jaime started, and I'm so grateful that he did, and we continue on, is to recognize that some people will never go to the Katy Prairie. Either they don't have the way to get there or they don't want to get there, but we want to let them recognize what the value of the Katy Prairie is. And we started our Prairie Builders Parks and Schools program, in which we're able to actually develop prairies that are in parks, in schools, in universities, so that people can see not only what a prairie looks like, but what a prairie does, how it helps them learn science, how it helps them learn about holding water, but also how it helps learn about their community, so that they can see how they were a part of Texas, whether or not they are a person of color or they are an immigrant, as many of us are, because we all came here. We weren't the first settlers. And so, it's important for us to be able to do that. And so, I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about other things, but that's who we are and what we do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And last but not least is Kelly Andrasik with the Houston Parks and Rec Department. Take it away, Kelly.
Okay, let me get my screen. Okay. So my name is Kelly Andrasik. I'm the Natural Resources Manager with the Houston Parks and Recreation Department. And I have worked in urban habitats for a long time. So I started out, my first real job was at Armand Bayou Nature Center, which is an urban habitat in Pasadena. I grew up in this area, and so I'm very familiar with the area. And I have a bachelor's degree in business, actually, and then I have a master's degree in environmental science and a master's degree in environmental management. And a lot of my background early on was in wildlife, actually. So I did my thesis research on a brackish water turtle that is found in Galveston Bay called the diamondback terrapin. I spent 4 years doing turtle research at Armand Bayou. I also did alligator research, and I worked for Fish and Wildlife for a little while and did a lot of bird research there. And so I have a lot of wildlife background, but also Armand Bayou, has a really great prairie and riparian system. And so I got to work in all of those habitats and wetland habitat. Same with Fish and Wildlife. I worked at Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge in McFadden. I was a wildland firefighter as I worked there. So I got to work in the marsh, in that type of habitat, driving airboats and catching ducks, in the middle of the night. And so just really great experience there. But also, all of those areas were really good, knowledge of urban, and I was a consultant also, an environmental consultant, dealing with a lot of wetland habitat and biological assessments, and that led me to working for the city of Houston. And so I'm in the Natural Resources Management program within the Parks Department. That program has existed for a little over 7 years. Prior to that, there was no focus on preservation of land. Really, there was no organization within our department to focus on that. And overall, the Parks Department has about 380 parks, over 25,000 acres of land that we manage. And we also, through our urban forestry section, oversee the medians and right-of-ways, trees within those. And so I think as far as this program, which, the Natural Resources focuses on the undeveloped land within the parks, And we do habitat management, habitat restoration, any type of wildlife issue, and also research of those things. And we really have, as far as with the climate action, have a really good opportunity to implement some of these nature-based solutions because we are a large landowner for the city of Houston. So this map just shows a couple of our initiatives, and in the purple is most of our proposed nature preserves. I left out Lake Houston Wilderness Park, which is at the top, but it made my map too small to see the other ones, but that's one of our really big properties. So overall, we're targeting over 7,000 acres of land to preserve within a nature preserve ordinance. We also, but in the green on here is our proposed riparian restoration initiative, which we're already implementing. By the end of this year, we'll have restored 10 parks, but overall the initiative is targeting all parks adjacent to a waterway to create forested buffers, and so that will increase canopy cover throughout the city. We're also able to do some implementation to increase canopy cover through these medians and just our general park area. We have the opportunity to install green stormwater infrastructure in our parks. And then we've created a tree farm to really support some of these projects. So we're trying to grow local native species to support the riparian and other initiatives, and to have more diversity and provide more diverse plantings for these projects. And we also do prairie restoration. So we have 5 parks right now that we have prairies that we're working in, about 130 acres of land in those parks. And we have a big native plant propagation program. So we go out and collect native seed from remnant and restored prairies around Houston. We propagate those in our greenhouse, and then those plants come out in 1-gallon pots into our prairie sites through community events. And then we do monitoring of habitat and wildlife for our program.
All right. Well, super. Thank you all. And so we're going to start off with some questions for our panelists. Then we're going to get to some questions that the audience has brought forth. I've seen at least a couple of questions. And to be fair, all the easy problems in the world have been solved, right? Fortunately, we have 3 brilliant speakers. And to be truthful, in our list of participants, there's some really amazing professionals out there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and go for the harder questions. So Katie and Kelly and Marianne, but I'm going to start with Katie. There's been a lot of talk about equity, justice, inclusion, all of these concepts in the news lately. People are starting to see that it's very much a part of the climate plan and how we're trying to get to more equitable outcomes. What are some of the big opportunities that you saw in the Houston Resilient Plan to close equity gaps using nature?
Yeah, so you're switching it up on me a little bit, and I think you alluded to one when we talked earlier about urban canopy. And I think access to nature are 2 key things, but I think also the co-benefits of those are important too. So for instance, on urban canopy, we know that urban canopy is not equitably distributed. But we also know that if you are able to integrate more urban canopy or more canopy in general, we know that it can reduce energy burden of homeowners or of renters by increasing energy efficiency. We know that it has the potential to potentially improve air quality, especially in places where air quality is a concern. And there's a lot of places in Houston with a lot of industry and a lot of other issues related to air quality or even soil quality. And across the U.S., school absenteeism is asthma is the #1 cause of school absenteeism. So this is again, connecting the dots between the built environment and the green environment, the environmental variables that are out there, and how that has implications from an equity perspective on our youth in particular. I think also thinking about heat. I know that you have been a big proponent of a lot of the work that Houston's doing to map urban heat, and I think that when you're thinking about what people request most out of any parks plan we do, it's at least in our top 5, if not top 3, people need more shade. And so if trees can provide that, that's fantastic. And so then we're also thinking about the ways that we can reduce urban heat island. In our Montrose study, for instance, we're looking at around a 10-degree or more difference in temperature when we look at the Landsat between a place like River Oaks Shopping Center and like some of the areas around the Menil. And so again, heat is really problematic. And I think for heat and air quality, those have real implications for populations who are transit dependent, and also have real implications for populations who are vulnerable, who those two things intersect often, transit dependent and vulnerable. So when you're thinking about people with chronic health issues, seniors, you know, especially those populations can be impacted by air quality and heat island issues. For instance, you know, a lot of studies have shown that if you don't have AC that works really well, or if you have window AC, not only are you not getting as much relief at night after a major heat event during the day, it also doesn't have as good of a filter on it to filter out the outdoor air pollutants, and then your indoor air quality is poor. So, you know, this all stacks up, and for folks who don't get that recovery at night, also have those air quality issues inside and as they're pedestrians or using transit, those have huge implications. And then the last thing I'll say is just the mental health benefits associated with green in cities. That's something that I think about a lot. My last quote that I shared, I hope kind of reveals that intersection for me on thinking about coping with change as a planner and systematically, but also as individuals, and that there's a lot of trauma associated with climate change. And so I think mental health benefits of green, whether it's trees or other green features or water features, there's plenty of literature that shows that there's a huge correlation between greening spaces and health benefits, physical and mental health. I'll stop there.
This is why I love this panel. It's like a jazz ensemble. That wasn't the question that I gave her earlier, but she handled it beautifully. And I'm going to kind of stay on that track. So, you know, Katie was talking about vulnerable human populations that are underserved and are suffering disproportionately from lack of tree canopy cover and other natural amenities. Kelly, I'm going to go ahead and put you on the spot here and talk about another vulnerable community that people don't think about oftentimes, which is the wildlife community. I tend to think of it as there was just a report that came out. The World Wildlife Fund just came out with a report the other day that said that we've lost 58% of the animals on Earth in the last 50 years. It's staggering, and it has real implications for human health and durability on this planet. So how do you perceive your work in getting our city to a better place by doing these plantings, these restorations, wildlife or nature preserve designations, as helping those wild Houstonians meet what their needs are as an emerging climate takes hold?
You know, our first step is targeting preservation of some of, you know, our big properties. As you know, over time, you know, small pieces are getting chipped away. You know, there's special interest groups that want to build a ball field in a park, and a lot of people see, you know, some of these forested areas. It's just we haven't made it to those areas yet. You know, they're waiting for development, and that's not what we want to be happening in our city. So we've targeted, it's about 25 parks right now, but we're looking to increase that some, that we have identified land within those that we can preserve. And so that would preserve habitat for existing wildlife that's already in Houston. And then obviously once we preserve that land, we would, you know, work on restoring the habitat. So we've done some assessments of some of our riparian areas so far. And about 40% of the species that in our plots are actually invasive, not just non-native, but invasive species. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we do have some parks that were historic forested habitat that are large, that are much better, but you know, some of the ones that are more toward the urban core, you know, need some work. So once we preserve this land, you know, we try to find funding to restore it. And And so we also focus on native species. I mentioned before that we're going out, we want like local, we want local ecotypes that support the wildlife from this area. So we're getting the seeds locally, and we just created this new tree farm, which we were starting with bare root trees that we purchased, but now we're really looking to go out and collect seeds from trees and figure out how to successfully grow specific species, and that'll provide not only the local types of species, but also species that you just can't buy at a nursery. A lot of the understory species we just can't get. So really focusing on these native species and a lot of diversity, as much diversity as possible. We spent a lot of time researching our new tree list for the city of Houston, and that's going to go to council soon. But it's all native species. And so we were looking at species that were historically native to the Houston area. So Harris County, 2 adjacent counties were our range for that. And we went back and tried to find, really historic representations of those species in that area. And we've come out with a really diverse list of native trees that hopefully will pass and will be, at least on city land and right of way, will be the only species that you can plant within the city of Houston. And so I think that focusing on, native species, also for our restoration projects, we try to focus on the historic habitat. So a lot of Houston was prairie. And a lot of our parkland that was previously forested is completely covered in Chinese tallow, which has just taken over some of these areas. And that's another good indicator that it was historic prairie, if it's almost all tallow. And we can see that on historical imagery. And so what we're trying to do is come in, if it was historic prairie, we restore it to prairie. And then our riparian initiative, we're trying to restore these buffers along the bayous that once existed and were cleared. And hopefully these provide, a great corridor for wildlife that we can protect. So preserving the land, restoring the land is something that we try to focus on.
Excellent, thank you. One of the emerging themes here is really this intersectionality between the city, the region, equity, and how that plays with both humans and wildlife populations. Marianne, I'm going to ask you this last question before we get to the community questions. And that is, let's say that the city decides to purchase offset credits. So they want to offset some of their carbon, emissions. Talk to me a little bit about the regional nature of green infrastructure writ large, like the Katy Prairie and the corridors that you're trying to connect with headwaters to baywaters. Why should people in the city use their money to purchase lands outside of the city or to protect or restore those lands? What's in it for them?
Okay, well, I guess I'll give you a quote. I love how Katie did quotes, so I better give a quote. Jane Jacobs once said that great cities need great countryside close by. And we do, because cities don't exist by themselves. Just as you mentioned earlier, that if the wildlife aren't healthy, people aren't healthy. We need to look to this whole system. So saving the Katy Prairie, saving land along our creeks and bayous and our waterways, saving things along, at Armand Bayou or Galveston Bay are critical because it adds to our nature's ability to protect us. There are natural defenses. So, So almost, that's a Texas thing with the defenses instead of defenses. So anyway, natural infrastructure obviously are the sort of intact or restored systems like the, solutions that we use, like, shorelines and wetlands and prairies and forests. The nature-based solutions are ones that are going to instead be mimicking those kinds of things. How can we have, an engineered oyster reef so that we can get the oysters back, those kinds of things. And then the green infrastructure, of course, and we do all of that. I mean, not just us, but other land trusts, other entities like the Nature Conservancy or Bayou Land Conservancy are trying to save those things because we can't be all pavement. even if we have the best rules in the world and regulations that say you can't put one drop of water on your neighbor, then it still is not going to be a great place to live. So we look at those kinds of systems that can help us to, improve air and water quality, can, provide wildlife habitat, recreation, the mental health that Katie talked about, but also green infrastructure. I saw a question in the chat that talked about what can people do if they're not able to save thousands of acres. Well, green infrastructure is now more, used to be just all those natural infrastructure things and the nature-based things, but now it's more on stormwater and using nature to capture water, to clean water, those kinds of things. But all of us could do, you could do rain barrels, you could do, green roofs. We can do, detention under streets, those kinds of things help. But also, and you and I know that this is a pet project of mine, that if it ever gets done, it's going to be amazing. But, we can have different kinds of lawns too, whether it's letting our grass grow longer so that it has deeper roots and it holds more water, or it's planting native species so that it holds more water. But I know Steve Costello has said that if we could each hold 1 foot of water on our property, it would relieve flooding immensely. Would it stop it? Would it eliminate? No, we have too much water, we're too flat, but it would help our bayous, it would help our drainage systems. So what if we could hold 2 inches with native grasses or with these green roofs? So those are the kinds of things that I think everybody should help. And then the other thing is that I think about saving large swaths of green space as something that we might not do for ourselves. It's like we're renting them, saving them for our children and our grandchildren, because someday they're going to go out there and they're going to say, isn't it amazing the foresight that my parents, our forefathers, our grandparents had, just like Central Park. People love to go to Central Park. If somebody hadn't thought it's in our best interest to do this for the future, it wouldn't get done. So it's the same thing here. You have some short-term benefits, but you also have amazing long-term benefits because that land's protected forever.
Okay, I'm going to ask all of our co-hosts to unmute themselves. We're going to take some questions from the audience now. So you guys have provided way too many questions to answer in the time we have left, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and copy all these questions down, and we'll send them to our wonderful panel for answering afterward. But let me go ahead and ask this question. So there was a great article in the Houston Chronicle about how flood recovery has happened since Harvey. And one of the things that is coming up is the reuse of flood buyout areas, or the redevelopment of other areas, to your point, to all of your points, which is that all the surfaces that we have in the city, in the area, need to work harder if they're not already optimized. They can be soaking up our water, they can be shading us, they can be growing food. We have a lot of what I call lazy landscapes that we give and give and give, and they emit a lot of carbon, lawns being my personal bugaboo. So how do we see the financing, to a great question from Paresh, what kinds of financing or impact bonds or other things are coming on the market now to help us activate all these climate action strategies to bring more nature to the fore? What are you guys seeing out there?
Okay, I'll start. One of the things that we're seeing is that investors are looking for ways to actually help. And yes, they want a return on their money, but they're beginning to see that not only can they do good, they can actually invest and get a return. And so they're looking at different kinds of options. Sometimes it might be regulatory. So like in Baltimore and in Chesapeake Bay, they have rules and requirements on carbon sequestration and offsets, which we don't have. Ours is all voluntary. And I know Jim Blackburn's doing a great job with his Texas Coastal Exchange program. But again, people have to want to do it. They aren't, forced to do it. And I'm not, opining on which way is the better way, but it is. I think that also we found that in Texas, about 84% of the population is supportive of even local bonds, whether it's a county bond or it's a city bond, for open space, conservation. We just need to get the question in front of them, and they pass overwhelmingly. And I know that's maybe a more traditional thing, but people are willing to tax themselves if they feel that it's going to benefit them long term. And I know that I'm actually on a conference call that the U.S. Endowment is doing, where they are trying to develop innovative sources of funding and new ways to actually restore land and to protect land. So I think, you know, people are starting to do that all over the country, including here in this region.
I would just add that I think it's important to note that in this climate plan, like, we don't get to carbon neutrality in 2050 without offsets, and offsets cost money, real money. And I think that we have not had those hard conversations yet about what that looks like or who's paying for those. But we need to. And I also, Dr. Blackburn is really visionary in pushing forward his work on, you know, the coastal exchange and the carbon market work. But those things really need to be set up soon for us to really make sure that we're going to reap those benefits. And that's true in Austin too. We don't have anyone pushing that here, but we're still saying in our plan, like, hey, we need a carbon market in Austin so that we can have regional benefits, so that we're not saving rainforests in Brazil, which is certainly valuable, but that we actually get those co-benefits here locally of storing that carbon, maintaining those carbon sinks. And then I think the other thing is, I think there's a bit of a moral dilemma that Houston's going to have to deal with. So a lot of other cities in Texas look at Houston and say, you have deep pockets in philanthropy, right? Or corporate funding for this kind of work. But the expense of taking money from folks in certain industries or whatever, I'm not going to get into the details of that, is, I think that it really limits our ability to build trust with community and build equitable process. And whether or not that's just a perception issue or there are strings attached, I actually think it's more the first. I think it's more of the perception of taking money from corporate funders to get this work happening on the ground. But, you know, I will say that when we were trying to get a resolution passed through City Council to do a resilience plan in Austin, so you're ahead of us on the resilience work. We don't have one yet. People really got up in arms about saying anything in that resolution about even just exploring corporate partnerships to help fund the resilience strategy. So, like, I think we need to grapple with what that does to our ability to really build trust with community around this work as well, which I think is really important.
I'll just quickly add, I'm the queen of working off of, very small budget. So, most of the restoration we do is grant funded, but also, some of this work is really easy to do pretty cheaply. Like, we're going out and collecting seed with just staff and volunteers, and we're growing it in our greenhouse, the same with trees. And I agree with the carbon offsets, and definitely that's something that we're looking into and currently, exploring. So I think that's something that will be in Houston soon.
All right, so I think we have excellent answers. We got time for one question. I'm going to kind of mix up some of the questions here into one, which just goes really to the durability of this movement. Obviously, you all have been working on these issues for a long time. We have a highly diverse and rapidly diversifying city in terms of demographics. A lot of times the folks who are working in this field are not mirroring the general population, i.e. We could use some real diversity in the conservation environmental movement. How do you guys perceive the opportunity to train up a new generation of conservationists and environmentalists that's more reflective of the city in meeting our climate and equity goals that the city has put out there?
Jaime, can I go again first?
Sure.
So we're part of something that the Land Trust Alliance is doing called Gaining Ground. And the first part of it is to try to double the amount of land that's conserved, but also to make it more accessible to people. And in the initial data that they've done, they found out that 25-year-olds to 54-year-olds are more concerned about saving land than a lot of old white folks, excuse the expression. And they're concerned about it maybe for different reasons. It might be food security. It might be access to jobs and programs, science for their kids. But they are concerned and they want to do something. And so they're also concerned extremely a lot about climate change because it really hits brown and black populations far more than it hits more affluent white ones. And I should also put in, socially, economically disadvantaged populations too, so that there are very many vulnerable communities. And so one of the things that we need to do is to listen. Find out what are their concerns. Are there ways that what we're doing can intersect with what they do and they need, or are there things we should be doing differently? And when you talk about training up young people, for example, we've been trying to work with Student Conservation Association, which is a great group that is training up young people to learn about what green jobs are like and how they might have a future in them. But if they don't see job descriptions that mirror them, that look like what they look like, that maybe replace education for experience, we're not going to encourage those people to come to us. And until we start getting them and start getting many of them, it's either just tokenism or they're not coming at all. So that's what we're trying to work on at a national level. But also I think locally, a lot of us are members of the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. And we're beginning to hear from people who actually work in those communities and who have access, instead of trying to bring our voice to them, instead saying, help us figure out what their voices are and how can we work together.
Yeah, and maybe I could just add, if you don't mind me going next. I think that the difference between diversity and inclusion and equity and justice is who you're getting to the table and then what do you do after they get there. Mm-hmm. And I think we're a little bit too far in the first two words and not the second two words. And I think actually something I didn't get to in my presentation that I promise, very quick in sharing, if you can see it.
We can see it.
Okay. Is just like these three ways I've been thinking about the way we think about equity in this work. And the first is, this is how I think most of us are doing it in our planning and design and implementation work, our policy work, is we're kind of saying, hey, it would be great if we can get some equity co-benefits out of this. It would be great if we can kind of work that in, we'll see, right? I think one step further is, how do we constantly apply an equity lens and at least are more aware of the equity implications, both negative and positive, of our work? But where I think we are really trying to get is really that any plan, policy, design, implementation is not successful without equity at its core. And I think those are three fundamentally different ways of setting up processes, of setting up a framework, of really framing the work. And I think that that's one of the ways that we're going to get more people at the table who are engaged in this work, who are going to trust that we get it, to be honest. I feel like building back trust is going to be also cultivating a lot of empathy for the folks in the room who've been around a while or been traditionally trained to think a certain way. I think we also just need to be more empathetic in general to seeing things different and listening, as Marianne said.
So I would just say that, we have an equity conversation every day, and we have 380 parks throughout the city. And so we're constantly looking at that. And, I'd like to think that, our riparian initiative is following the waterways, which are pretty equitable throughout the city. So, we're trying to disperse nature, same with the nature preserve, to get it all throughout the city. But as far as community input, I think, in the past, I think there's been a lack of nature in some of these options for communities. And that's something that we're really trying to change. And I think plans like the Houston's Climate Action Plan help to support that with these, goals. To add that into these community input so that can be one of the things that they check that they would like to see in their parks.
I couldn't agree more. I think that what we see sometimes is a notion by well-meaning people that folks in disadvantaged or under-resourced communities, they get nature once all the rest of their problems, I'm using this in air quotes, get solved. But just like art, music, everything that's affirming about life, nature should not be a a bug, it should be a feature, right? So, and they're wanting that, and the data is showing that as well. So yes, having them at the table to co-create solutions for themselves and making sure that nature is on the table is really great. So guys, we are at time. I know that we didn't have a chance to answer all the excellent questions that you guys have, but as you can see, this is a highly dynamic process and system. We got some dynamic thinkers who are working on this problem. They do need your help. And their capes get tired sometimes, but we hope that you do well. You're healthy. We will send out these questions, the remaining questions, to our excellent panelists. I can't thank them enough for their time, and also for our audience's time. We appreciate everything that you do to make our communities better, and we hope to speak with you soon and to push forward the initiatives of the Houston Climate Action Plan. We now have a guidepost, a place to start, and let's go ahead and lean in together. So on behalf of myself and the Nature Conservancy and all the groups that are represented here and the city, we thank you for your time, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Sammy.
Bye.
Thank you.